From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Caitlin Lyons.
Donald Trump holding his second news conference in as many weeks from Bedminster, New Jersey, as we speak, while his opponent Kamala Harris makes her first joint appearance with President Biden since he left the presidential race.
This ahead of Harris's planned economic policy speech in North Carolina tomorrow. We'll have more with Andra Gillespie of Emory University and our political panel this hour.
Plus, we'll be joined by Jonathan Panikoff of the Atlantic Council as Gaza ceasefire negotiations open in Doha without Hamas at the table and with the remaining threat of Iranian retaliation against Israel. Welcome to the Thursday edition, the late edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington with an eye on Donald Trump. Don't think he's taken a question yet. Bedminster, the location. This was billed as a news conference. And Kaylee, he's got half a grocery store outside with him.
Yeah, in fact, he is still speaking at that news conference, and Joe is exactly right. He is literally surrounded by groceries and signs that dictate how much the prices of those items have gone up during the Biden administration as he hits his opponent, Vice President Harris, specifically on the economy.
Grocery prices have skyrocketed. Cereals are up 26%. Bread is up 24%. Butter is up 37%. Baby formula is up 30%, flour is up 38%, and eggs are up 46%, and many items are up at much higher rates than that.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Akayla, Gardner, and Josh Wingrove, both covering the White House for us here at Bloomberg. It's great to see both of you. Welcome back to the table. Josh, you covered Donald Trump when he was in the White House, never one to shy away from using props. It reminds me of the Clemson visit with all the Big Macs and the fast food out on the tables. Would this have happened if Kamala Harris was not outlining her economic proposal tomorrow?
Yes, maybe, because many Republicans think that this is the best line of attack to go after Democrats on. Many Democrats think that, too. I mean, for months, Democrats have been always begging Joe Biden to talk more about this. Bob Casey jumps to mind as a Democrat who's been campaigning in a swing state about this issue. Mm-hmm. And across many Western democracies, incumbents have been dropping like flies because of voter outrage over grocery prices, and many of those things are true. I have a baby. I can tell you how expensive formula is. Thankfully, she's on milk now. Thank God.
There's milk out.
Right, exactly. Right, but still, you're better off. You're better off. So I think right now this is a potent attack for him, and the big question with Trump always is, does he stay on message or not? And this event so far, from what we've been hearing, it sounds, there's like reading the teleprompter of Trump, and that's what we're getting a lot of today, him reading these attacks. And then there's riffing Trump, and that's when he sort of veers into other places, and he's always more comfortable there. And the tension for the aides working for him is always, how do you blend the two? How do you capture the sort of energy where Trump wants to go while trying to keep him disciplined? And so we'll see how it goes tonight. But right now, every day that they make this election a referendum on inflation, it's a good day for Republicans. Mm-hmm. Every day Trump is going in other directions, that's when you see Democrats celebrating, like they did his last press conference, when he really sort of, takes an off-ramp and goes into other places.
Well, and it's notable that we're seeing Donald Trump do this today with the grocery store in tow, one day ahead of an economic policy speech that Vice President Harris is planning in North Carolina, in which we understand she is planning to focus on grocery prices and specifically price gouging on the part of corporations. Is a little bit of thunder being stolen here, Akayla?
Yeah, I think it's not by accident we saw him using these groceries as prices. We're going to hear our first glimpse into Harris's economic policy tomorrow, where she plans to unveil this plan to do a federal ban on price gouging, specifically on groceries. It's kind of unclear how she would do that. It seems like it would require legislation, but she's certainly signaling here that she's aware that voters are concerned about the economy, and groceries is certainly something that voters see every single week. It's something that's top of mind for them, and she's certainly targeting that here.
Well, we heard this idea come up actually at an event today. It was the big reunion. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris on stage together for the first time since the president dropped out of the race. And part of the idea was to highlight work done in lowering prices, and namely drug prices today. Deals with drug manufacturers to lower prices for senior citizens by as much as 79%. Let's listen.
I'm proud to announce that Medicare has reached agreement with all manufacturers on all 10 drugs selected in the first round of negotiations. The new lower prices for all 10 drugs will go into effect in January of 2026. Not this January, next January.
This was just outside of the capital, Josh, in Prince George's County, Maryland. Very friendly crowd. They seem to have been carefully warmed up with the call and response that we witnessed a couple of times. But for them to be together like this, the day before Kamala Harris has to prove that she's got something different to offer, presents quite a balancing act for her.
Yeah, this is how he is trying to help her. Part of it is staying out of the limelight, and part of it is rolling out the stuff that he wanted to run on himself, and they want to run on it because, generally speaking, it's popular. Democrats would love to campaign on cheaper drug prices up and down the court, and this is one of those things that they've been fighting for decades, to be able to get. So this was one of those days in the Biden administration that the people that have been working in it since day one will sort of remember in their memoirs. They thought this was just such a seismic change that they were able to get through, and Harris really is campaigning on, like, sort of, you might call it Biden plus, or, it's like she's building on the Biden record rather than throwing out the playbook and starting anew. In particular, our reporting is that she really isn't starting a lot from what her own proposals had been in 2019 or before that when she was a senator, and then when she ran, of course, for the nomination that Joe Biden won. So right now, she's trying to have her cake and eat it too, and probably can a little bit because polls show that she's not getting as much blame for inflation and other issues. So Biden is helping her by teeing up these issues. She can now go out tomorrow and say, look at the action we got on prices, drug prices. This is a big deal. We want to do more. For instance, expanding the cap on insulin costs at $35 a month to everyone right now. That's sort of a narrower cap with voluntary cooperation for other groups. Expanding the cap on drug price, out-of-pocket drug costs, and potentially expanding the list of negotiated drugs. So she wants his help, but she also wants to stake her own way, and that's the balancing act that they're trying.
Well, as he helps her tee up the issues, he also just helped hype her up today, and she did some hyping up of her own in return. Just take a listen to some of the language we got from the current vice president and president as they appeared together.
I could speak all afternoon about the person that I am standing on this stage with. Our extraordinary President Joe Biden.
I have an incredible partner. The progress we've made, she's going to make one hell of a president.
So, Akayla, while today was about policy, and as Josh alludes to, policy that Biden has been trying to achieve for a very long time, this also was about a moment in which we see an incumbent president who made the decision not to seek re-election, who has to hand the reins to his vice president, a literal passing of the baton, as we saw them on stage together for the first time since he made that momentous decision.
Yeah, it was certainly a moment of unity there, but I think it was interesting that Harris spoke before Biden, even though she is still the person who is running for president. So she still has to do this awkward dance. And I think even when he is not in the room, she has regularly praised him and talked about his service. But she still has to define herself separately from him. And I think we're starting to hear her talk about her time in the Senate, her time as Attorney General, going after corporate banks, targeting for-profit colleges. So she's trying to still create this own lane that is separate and apart from Biden, while also still acknowledging those voters who wanted him to run, who wanted him to stay in the race. And I think that's why we're really seeing this effort really to show respect for Biden and his legacy.
That to be an emotional moment for him. I mean, this is an actual White House event, I believe, but it felt a lot like a campaign rally. He's going to have the big speech on Monday, but from now on, it's no longer about him. He's going to be trying to help Kamala Harris get elected.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, he endorsed her, and I think that was a huge part, and that will play out in his legacy, is him clearly setting up this field for her.
I think there's hints that he's still having what-if moments.
Interesting.
Today, talking about, now I'm, quote, too damn old, when he talked about being too young to take a seat in the Senate when he was elected at 29. Yesterday, lecturing the press on why they weren't writing about the economy in a more positive way. It feels like he's still running through his mind about how did I get here? But he's not giving a hint.
In that crowd?
He's not giving a hint of daylight or subterfuge or anything with Harris. So he's steadfast supporting her. You just see these moments of him wondering aloud what might have been, I think.
All right, Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove and Akayla Gardner covering the White House and the campaign for us. Thank you both so much. And coming up, as we look ahead to that outlining of the economic plans of Vice President Harris in North Carolina tomorrow, we'll be joined by Emory University Professor of Political Science, Andra Gillespie. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
stays at a heavyweight.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Former President Donald Trump is still speaking at a news conference at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, though at this point, more than 30 minutes in, he still has yet to take any questions from the press. He is, though, surrounded by groceries and talking about higher prices. So for more now, we welcome in Emory University political science professor Andra Gillespie, who has, of course, kept a close eye on this campaign. It is noteworthy to consider the optics here, Andra, as Donald Trump is surrounded by coffee canisters and ground meat and cereal boxes and signs that indicate these prices have gone up during the course of the administration, knowing that tomorrow Vice President Harris will be giving a speech in North Carolina also talking about prices and price gouging. Specifically, how are voters likely to look at these two in contrast to one another?
Well, they are going to view it through the lens of partisanship, but I think there's also going to be a question of how believable and how empathetic both candidates are in expressing their concerns about where we are with inflation and what their prospective solutions are for it. I can't help but think about the 1992 presidential campaign and the debate question where George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton were asked to basically describe how much basic groceries cost, and one was closer than the other in actually being aware of sort of what the standard price was for a gallon of milk or the price of bread. And so while President Trump wants to seize on anxiety about inflation and blame the Biden and by extension the Biden-Harris administration for causing inflation, Vice President Harris's approach tomorrow, we suspect, is going to be to talk about structural issues that actually would put more focus on the market and suggest that it isn't the Inflation Reduction Act, it wasn't any of the COVID rescue plans that really increased inflation, but it was businesses that were taking advantage of, low supply chains and other issues to raise prices and then keep them high unnecessarily. So, I expect Democrats and Republicans are going to respond in kind and sort of root for their team. But I think that there is a question about which of these candidates looks more like they've actually tried to, put a week's worth of meals together for $200 or, actually knows what goes into a grocery list in order to put a casserole together. That might be the one that pulls up at those people in the middle who are still making up their minds.
It is interesting to consider that one of them worked at McDonald's and the other one did not. We were just talking about the gallon of milk moment in 1992, Andra. I don't know if you could relive or replay that now, considering the candidates we're talking about. But part of the reason why Donald Trump is out there and he's got all the prices, if it's not just the food stuffs he's got there, but also big murals or big boards up with prices on them, showing increases over time, showing the price for milk and meat and so forth. This was billed as a news conference, though, and he has not taken a single question yet. Part of the reason why he's doing this is to highlight the fact that Kamala Harris has not held a news conference. What would happen if she did what Donald Trump is doing and never took a single question from reporters?
She would continue to be attacked by Republicans for sure, and there would certainly be grumblings in the press that would likely make their way into mainstream news reports, and then it would just become a question of what people are thinking about. So the idea that this has become a news item means that there may be people who might not have thought about it if it hadn't been mentioned before, who are going to think about it now, and depending on what their priors were in terms of kind of what their previous commitments were and some of what their previous thoughts were, this could actually enhance their opinion of Vice President Harris, or it could actually diminish their opinion of Vice President Harris. Suffice to say, part of the reason why Vice President Harris hasn't taken a news conference yet is because she hasn't had to, and because she's had the luxury of being able to say she was putting a campaign together. But I think the long-term question is, how long can you say, I haven't had time to sit down for a press conference or for an interview without that the excuses about, having to put together a campaign at the last minute start to ring really hollow. So I think that, in due time, she is going to have no choice but to sit down and take questions from people. And then I think the contrast will be, how does she respond to questions in the same manner and with the same type of bravado that Donald Trump does? Because while Donald Trump has subjected himself to interviews and has answered questions, he's also been combative at times when it hasn't been helpful to him. And he's also answered questions in outrageous ways that actually also are a distraction from, I think, the main point of his campaign, or at least what his handlers would prefer that he say.
Yeah, certainly you're seeing more Republicans outwardly criticizing his lack of discipline, if you will, even the likes of Vivek Ramaswamy, who has been a big advocate of his. Also, when we consider the decision making on the Harris campaign to expose herself to the press and ad lib opportunities or not, you could see the argument that might suggest that she already is doing well enough, or at least comparatively better than Biden was at this point without that. If you take a look at the latest research from Pew, shows her leading point 1 point up against Donald Trump nationally among registered voters, 46 to 45. But what I found so interesting is you look at the minority demographics here. Andra, 77% of black voters said they are supporting or leaning toward Harris, compared to 64% who said the same about Biden just weeks ago. Hispanic voters favor Harris over Trump by a 17-point margin. In July, Biden and Trump were tied among Hispanic voters. What do you see happening here?
Well, I mean, I think that there are a number of factors at play. Part of it is the enthusiasm gap. So we've seen enthusiasm increase amongst voters, Democratic voters in general, and voters of color who are more likely to be Democratic than Republican voters. There were concerns about Biden's age, that people didn't necessarily have an outlet to be able to vent. And now that age has been taken off of the table for the Democratic nominee, there are people who are more comfortable aligning themselves with the Democratic candidate. Some of this could be, a bit of a bandwagon effect, if you will. So there were folks who were really concerned about Joe Biden's prospects for being able to win the election. And as we have seen the trend line move in a more positive direction with Harris on the ticket, Democratic voters who might have been reluctant to support a ticket that they didn't think was going to win now feel a little bit more buoyed and enthusiastic about this ticket. And that's being expressed in their stated intent to turn out and in also what their vote choice is. So the question is that it's still August. There's still plenty of time for people to change their minds and become dispirited. So the Harris campaign is going to have to maintain this momentum, and they're going to have to keep the spirits of their voters up and make sure that they translate that enthusiasm into actual votes on Election Day. So mobilization is going to still be critical at this particular point. This race is still, too close to call, and both sides are going to have to put their level best effort in to make sure that they find every possible voter to get them to turn out to vote.
Well, I'm just wondering if we're going to have one less to talk about at some point soon, Andra. There's reporting today. First, the Washington Post and others followed. RFK Jr. sought a meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris to discuss endorsing her in exchange for a cabinet position. He has since publicly said that he is not interested in being part of a Harris administration, but these reports are still out there, and I wonder if you see his campaign, particularly now that he may not be on the ballot, it appears, in New York, winding down now.
Well, I mean, his candidacy was always a long shot candidacy. The question of ballot access is certainly really important in terms of, trying to gauge his actual success at actually being able to, in theory, be able to win 270 electoral college votes, which was always called into question. I think the larger question was, could he play spoiler? And with two very unpopular candidates at the top of the ticket in Joe Biden and Donald Trump, there was, a possibility that he could be more likely to play spoiler than other third-party candidates have played. So with Biden out of the race and Harris in, we've seen some of his support shift to the two major party candidates, because this isn't a sort of question of like having two sort of similarly matched in age and similarly matched in favorability candidates. And so people have clearer preferences there. And so it makes his third party candidacy sort of lose a little bit of its salience. And then that's compounded by the organizational mistakes, the fact that his family doesn't support him, and the fact that you're hearing these stories, founded or unfounded, but that actually kind of contribute to questions about his temperament and readiness to actually serve in any public capacity.
Yeah. Didn't even mention the bear meat. Andra, thank you. Andra Gillespie, great to have you back here on Bloomberg. Coming up, stocks surging following stronger than expected monthly retail sales. Bloomberg's Enda Curran is coming in next to talk to us about it on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
I think the consumer spending data, as I just mentioned, it's such a big part of the economy. Retail sales is one part of that picture, but of course it covers, a relatively small share. I think we want to look at the consumer spending writ large. We want to look at the part of retail sales that feeds into that, and of course we'll be all over that tomorrow.
Jared Bernstein, the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, talking with us yesterday. Today's monthly retail sales data we were discussing coming in stronger than expected, and yet another sign of resilience among American consumers. We're joined now by Bloomberg's Enda Curran with more. Enda, when you put the data on retail sales together with a report from Walmart that sends the stock to an all-time high, you start wondering why we're hearing talk still of recession.
Yeah, it was a reasonably good set of numbers. Retail sales up across the board, the biggest increase in roughly a year. And now there was an impact mostly because people buying cars, for example, due to some disruption the month before. But it was also broad-based in 10 of the 13 categories saw growth. So retail sales doing well. Like you mentioned, Walmart then coming out and saying things are holding up. For sure, people are keeping an eye on their pocket, but there's certainly no disaster. And by the way, we also had some unemployment data today, jobless claims, weakest in a few weeks, just suggesting that maybe the labour market's hanging in there as well. So all told today, reasonably good set of numbers.
So put it all together, and why in the world would the Fed feel like it needs to cut 50 basis points next month?
Yeah, I think the 50 basis point is probably going to be a harder case to make, but there is a lot of data over coming weeks. But to your point, Kaylee, I mean, over this past week, we've really had a confirmation, or a confirmation of the soft landing narrative. Inflation coming in, core inflation rising by the slowest since July 2001. Then, of course, you had the retail sales data today. Now, there are weak sectors, I should say, like manufacturing, industrial production suffering, housing market suffering. But, net all told, the economy's in a good space. Inflation's coming off the ball. It does set things up for September and the Fed.
Mm-hmm. That said, what's the next important piece of data that will complete the puzzle here?
I think the big one is next week's Jackson Hole. I should step back and just Vice President Harris will make some economic comments tomorrow. We've got to keep an eye on that in terms of what it does mean. But the big one is Jackson Hole next weekend and whether or not Fed Chair Jerome Powell does give a signal on what they're going to do in September.
All right, Bloomberg's Enda Curran, thank you so much. He's exactly right. Harris will be giving remarks in North Carolina tomorrow. Meantime, Donald Trump is still giving remarks in Bedminster, New Jersey. It's a news conference, and he just now, after 45 minutes, has begun taking questions. We'll bring you the latest on that as we get the news. And still ahead as well, we'll discuss formal negotiations over a Gaza ceasefire that kicked off today in Qatar and are set to continue tomorrow. We'll have more on that with Jonathan Panikoff of the Atlantic Council coming up, as the first question that Donald Trump received in this press conference was the last time he talked to Benjamin Netanyahu, and was also asked if he has any advice on a ceasefire deal. And he repeated that he doesn't think October 7th would have happened if he were still president. We'll have more details on the other side of the break. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're talking about two sides who have deep distrust on both ends, and Israel's goal at the end of the day is not the same as the United States' goal. Their goal ultimately is to defeat Hamas completely, and I think that they feel that that's not there yet, and Hamas knows that. So they're afraid that even after a ceasefire, Israel would resume some kind of violence, and so that's also in the background here.
That's Hagar Shamali, the former director for Syria and Lebanon of the National Security Council, talking with us a bit earlier about the outlook for ceasefire talks here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Formal talks mediated by the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt kicked off today in Doha. And Qatar's foreign minister now says they will move on into another day. They will continue Friday. And with us now is Jonathan Panikoff, the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Jonathan, it's great to have you back. Welcome back to Balance of Power. The fact that we're going into another day gives you optimism, and I ask you that knowing that Hamas is not even at the table.
Thanks so much for having me. Certainly, it gives me a little more optimism. Obviously, they felt like the progress was enough from today to warrant a second day. I don't think that means that they're necessarily close, however. I think there's a number of issues that still need to be resolved, almost certainly as we go forward. But the more time that they're negotiating, at least it means that all the parties are willing. Hamas may not be at the table, but the reality was they were never going to be in the same room with the Israelis anyways. They weren't the last set of negotiations either when Haniya, the former Hamas leader who was killed recently, was still alive. So I think there's reason for optimism as long as they have another day of negotiations all the way going forward.
But Jonathan, when you consider what the sticking point seems to be now and has been for months, it is this question around permanence. Hamas is looking for a permanent ceasefire, all Israeli forces leaving Gaza. We know that that is not something Israel has wanted. So someone is going to have to budge here, right? And I just wonder who you think has the greatest incentive to do so.
It's a great question. I mean, the real problem is they both have incentives to do so. On the Israeli side, Netanyahu has said that he wants complete destruction of Hamas. There's obviously a lot of skepticism, including within the Israeli military, security, intel, diplomatic establishment. That's even possible. It's become a bit of whack-a-mole, frankly, and we've had really diminishing marginal returns now as we go forward. And so there's a real question that Israel wants to be able to get the hostages back. That can't happen without a meaningful ceasefire. For Hamas, they're also struggling. We know from reports that Hamas is almost certainly short of weapons, that Hamas fighters who had a separate amount of food and water almost certainly are struggling to have enough of that for their fighters, for their terrorist operatives. And so it's going to be a real question of, can you somehow bridge the gaps? The plan was a temporary ceasefire first and hope that it moved to a permanent ceasefire. I think that's still the basis of the plan. We'll see whether it's enough, though, obviously, in the coming days.
Well, here we are, Jonathan, 2 weeks after Iran vowed to retaliate for the killing of the political leader of Hamas in Tehran. And Israel waits. Evelyn Farkas talked to us about this, the executive director of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University, talking about negotiations here, even as Iran waits for its moment. Here's what she said.
Every day that we have the Iranians poised to make an attack is a day where the risk of real escalation and all-out war, a full, multiple front war in Israel increases. We're at a very dangerous moment in time, and negotiations, as you know, appear stalled.
Jonathan, is Iran waiting to see what happens with ceasefire talks, or is it conducting its own planning right now?
I think it's doing both. I do think that they probably are waiting. There was a lot of warnings jointly from the U.S., from the U.K., from Germany, from France, from other allies that Iran really needs to reconsider whether it's going to have a strike like it did in April or something larger, that if they do, it could lead to a huge problem for the Iranian regime, including destruction of the government, of the economy. And we know that Iran has always prioritized its own internal stability and regime survival above everything else. At the same time, there's almost certainly a question of, if Iran doesn't respond, what does that mean in terms of deterrence? If a deal is successful, it may give Iran the opportunity to say, look, we're playing the bigger role for international peace and security. We're not going to respond in a meaningful way. But that doesn't mean you couldn't have other types of responses. It doesn't mean Hezbollah, which also lost a senior commander, wouldn't respond. Yeah. I think there's a split in the Iranian thinking internally and among their proxies.
Well, to that exact point, Jonathan, are we sure what Iran says goes for Hezbollah and the other proxies? Even if Iran itself said, OK, we're not going to launch anything from within our borders, does that guarantee that no one else will?
No, it absolutely doesn't. The reality is Iran's control of its proxies is far from absolute. You have on one end, for example, a group like the Houthis, in which Iran really has relatively little command and control, other than the Houthis are reliant on Iran for weapons. You've got Hezbollah somewhat in the middle, which is going to make its own political calculus, has been part of the Lebanese government for years, but it too is going to make its own calculus, even though it is more deferential to Iran than say, the Houthis. And then you have groups like the Iraqi Shia militants, which are a little all over the board, but Iran probably does have better command and control over most. It's a real range across the Iranian proxy threat network.
Can we assume, Jonathan, that the surge of U.S. military assets into the theater, we've spent a lot of time talking about guided missile subs, another aircraft carrier, F-22 jets, doing anything right now to deter an attack from Iran? Is that possibly why it's been this long?
I think it's certainly playing into the Iranian calculus. Look, I think there's really two things going on. I think internally in Iran, there probably is a split in terms of decision makers of how they want to respond. Ultimately, it's not up to the new president, Pezeshkian. It's going to be up to the IRGC and up to the supreme leader, ultimately, to make that determination. That doesn't mean that there aren't voices that are also going to be listened to, including in the SNSC, their National Security Council. The U.S. assets moving in only compound and reinforce U.S. messaging, European messaging on the potential threats Iran could face if they launch a major attack. And that's certainly going to be part of the Iranian calculus, as, again, they prioritize regime stability and regime survival above everything else.
Well, and of course, we have to consider this all comes against the backdrop of an ongoing race for president in the United States. Moments ago, Donald Trump was asked about the Middle East and whether or not he's spoken recently with Benjamin Netanyahu. He replied that he has not, but he did describe their meeting at Mar-a-Lago recently. Take a listen.
He knows what he's doing. I did encourage him to get this over with. You want to get it over with. It has to get over with fast. But have victory, get your victory, and get it over with. It has to stop. The killing has to stop.
But as he says, get it over with fast, Jonathan, do you think for Netanyahu, or frankly for Iran for that matter, the decision-making here is influenced by the knowledge that there's no guarantee that they will have a Trump president in January or a Harris president? They just know it won't be President Biden. Does that change the thinking here at all?
I don't know if it changes it completely. At the end of the day, you're really seeing a split between the Israeli security establishment and the political leaders. You've even seen Defense Minister Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, say that we're not going to be able to get all of Hamas and call for some sort of end to the war that we've seen going on since October of last year. The truth of the matter is, at the end of the day, this seems to be about a political calculus for both Yahya Sinwar and for Benjamin Netanyahu. And for Netanyahu, I think there's a real concern that once the war ends, it puts his own political position in jeopardy. I'm not saying that's the only thing driving him, but I'd be surprised if that's not part of the calculus. And so at this point, the idea that Harris, who certainly would want the war to be over, the vice president, former President Trump is also ironically saying the same thing, maybe the only thing they agree on. Neither of them wants to walk into the Oval Office with this war going on. I don't know how much Netanyahu actually cares about that.
All right, Jonathan Panikoff of the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your expertise, and hopefully we'll see you soon. And still ahead, the president of Columbia University stepping down in the wake of campus protests over this war in Gaza we've been discussing. We'll break it down with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Trying to reconcile the free speech rights of those who wanted to protest and the rights of Jewish students to be in an environment free of discrimination and harassment has been the central challenge on our campus and numerous others across the country. I have spent most of my time since becoming president on these issues, holding over 200 meetings with groups of students, faculty, alumni, donors, parents, some of whom are here, and 20 meetings with other university presidents to learn from each other.
Columbia University President Shafik testifying in Congress back in April amid pressure over protests on the school's campus. She announced her resignation yesterday, becoming the third leader of an Ivy League school to depart over turmoil tied to anti-Semitism and the conflict in Gaza. Joining us now for more, our political panel here on Bloomberg TV and radio, Lisa Camuso-Miller, former RNC Communications Director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast, and Kristen Hahn, Democratic strategist and partner at Rock Solutions. So obviously this is noteworthy in and of itself, but perhaps especially so as we are on the eve right now of not just back to school, but of the Democratic convention in Chicago, where there is a lot of concern about similar protests. Kristen, we're all getting flights to there over the weekend. How nervous are you about that?
I wouldn't say I'm nervous. I think the security part of this is all going to be handled.
What about the optics, though?
The optics. I mean, I think that this was going to happen. You know, it's an issue that is is happening in this country. It's, it's everybody's right to go. And if you want to protest, make your voices heard. This is something that's a fundamental right. It's happening at the convention. And I think that, all of our elected leaders and candidates will deal with it.
Republicans certainly made an issue out of this as the protests were taking place. This hearing was a big deal, made Elise Stefanik a household name for those who were watching it. To what extent will Republicans continue to push this as an example of what's wrong with Democratic politics when students, to Kaylee's point, come back to school and this potentially starts over again?
It absolutely is going to be continuing into the fall. I mean, college drop-off starts now, and I'm literally living that life right now. I will say, though, I think that this is a big discussion point and a big issue of contention, an issue that people are still looking, outside of sort of the traditional Republican base, are looking at the Republican ticket because specifically about policies in Israel and how they're handling the conflict that's happening in Gaza. And so I do think that there has to be some sort of strong and confident dialogue from both sides about how this will continue to go in a way that is supportive of our Jewish friends and allies that live not only here in the U.S., but all across the country and the globe, but also make sure that the conversation continues in a productive way, because it is one, I think, that the Democratic ticket is going to have to answer for, because President Biden is in office right now while the conflict is unfolding.
An important conversation to consider as we head for Chicago next week. Coming up, we'll turn back to the race for the White House with highlights from the campaign trail today. Our political panel back with us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It is my eternal and great, great, great honor, I have to tell you, to serve with this most extraordinary human being and American and leader, our President, Joe Biden.
Vice President Kamala Harris, President Joe Biden making their first joint appearance since President Biden's decision to drop out of the 2024 race. It happened today in Maryland on what has been a very busy day on the campaign trail. Donald Trump now holding a news conference at Bedminster, surrounded by groceries, as he tries to get to the very same issue that both Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were talking about, and that's lowering prices. Today it was specific to drugs. We'll hear more from Harris tomorrow on the economy as we reassemble our political panel. Lisa Camuso-Miller, former RNC Communications Director, host of the Friday Reporter podcast, and Kristen Hahn, Democratic strategist and partner at Rock Solutions. So this kind of reminds me of when the Clemson players came to the White House and he had all the Big Macs and the Whoppers and the Chick-fil-A's. He came out of Bedminster with half of a grocery store. He's got frozen sausage thawing out there. The point was to talk about grocery prices. He has since gone around the world and back again. We've done foreign policy. He says he does not respect Kamala Harris's intelligence. Is it another case of losing the message?
Oh, without question. I mean, yes, people are going to the grocery store and they're feeling the pinch. People are going to the pump and they're feeling the pinch. The feel and the impact that people are feeling in their budgets is real. Yeah. But when you are distracted by all of these other things that the former president is talking about, it's really, he needs to zone in on message and stay on message, and that has never been his strong point. And that's, I think, what you're hearing from the campaign and all across the party, is that people are feeling like he needs to zero in on what it is his administration will do that's good. And in fact, it's been this sort of distracted and sort of, rambling.
Well, and catching a lot of flack for personal attacks against his opponent, Vice President Kamala Harris. He was actually asked about that moments ago at this news conference, and this is what he said in response.
As far as the personal attacks, I'm very angry at her that she'd weaponized the justice system against me and other people. Very angry at her. I think I'm entitled to personal attacks. I don't have a lot of respect for her.
So if he feels entitled to the attacks, that probably suggests they aren't going to stop necessarily anytime soon, Kristen. So then it becomes a question of the appropriate response if you're Kamala Harris, knowing that he's talking about groceries today. You're planning on talking about that through the lens of price gouging tomorrow. What does she do with this moment when she gets to speak theoretically last tomorrow?
Well, I think we've done a lot of, we've learned a lot since the last time we lost to Donald Trump. It's been a while. But, you know, I think that the Democrats, and she is, need to make a point to talk about the issues. It is about the economy, acknowledge what needs to be done better. And she's doing that. But also, you know, hit Donald Trump where it hurts. I mean, there are reasons why the campaign's putting out video footage of the same venue they were both in, and hers is packed and his isn't. It really gets under his skin, and you can see it. You can see it because he's not going to stop calling her names. He's not going to stop questioning whether she's black or not, or when she acknowledged it. These things are not effective, but he can't help himself.
So let's fast forward to the debates that we learned a little bit more about today. There are going to be 2 presidential debates, at least according to the Harris campaign, one in October, they say, without any specifics. We also know there will be a single vice presidential debate that both campaigns have agreed on. But as far as the top of the ticket is concerned, everything that we're talking about here, how does that manifest itself on a debate stage with Kamala Harris?
Well, I think we've seen it in history. We've seen the way male candidates can very easily overstep and appear aggressive towards a female candidate. That is amplified by the fact that she also happens to be black and Native American.
Will he question that to her face?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
I mean, I think everything's on the table, and we should expect nothing less from Donald Trump because it's what we've seen all along. This is the brand. We know exactly what to expect. We should not expect anything different from him. It will be that kind of attack and that kind of nasty playing that he does with people rather than getting into the nitty-gritty and talking about the issues as it relates to how it's going to affect the American people, whether they select him or they select her.
So do you think he'll agree to an October debate, or will that just depend on what exactly goes down on the night of September 10th?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I think that it's going to be interesting to see. I think right now he'll say that he's going to debate her, but I mean, he is also, he's prone to make decisions that are the best for him in his own eyes. So depending on where we are at that point in the debate, and in the election, we'll get to know whether or not that debate will actually happen.
Interesting that after all of the contention around the Commission on Presidential Debates, we're going to end up with 2 presidential debates, 1 vice presidential debate, kind of just like it would have happened anyway.
Yeah.
Similar rules. We should note, though, there's no host yet for that October debate, correct?
No, or a date for that matter, or a response from the Trump campaign.
Well, we'll see what comes of it. You wonder to what extent the convention next week will guide decisions on this. Will Donald Trump be counter-programming or watching from home?
I mean, I think the campaign will try to be counter-programming in some way. I mean, they'll certainly have their opposition team and crisis team, you know, putting out imaging and messaging, you know, the entire time that the convention is going on. I don't think it's going to be effective.
And finally, as we close things out here, it is worth pointing out that as we began this segment, President Biden was on the stage with Harris today in what felt like a very physical manifestation of a passing of a baton. He even took a moment to joke about his age.
I served in the Senate for 270 years. I know I only look 40, but I'm a little bit older. The longest time I was too damn young because I was only about 29 when I got elected. Now I'm too damn old.
And of course, he will have the Monday night speaking slot at the convention next week. Kristen, how hard do you think all of this is for him when he still, according to all the reporting we've seen, believed that he could win this thing when he stepped down?
I think, I mean, it's probably difficult in some way, but he has said it to the American people. He believes in democracy. He believes this is what he has to do in order to beat Donald Trump. And I think that a lot of those people who we've actually seen in some of our polling, that internal polling, that there is a little bit of drop-off from people that really, you know, were voting for Joe Biden, and we can't overlook that, particularly in the down-ballot races. So I think it's really important that he get up there and that he's doing this, you know, talking about his support for Kamala Harris and, you know, that he's united with her.
It'll be interesting to see him on Monday and wonder what's going through his mind. Is it smart to do this today and keep distance between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris while they're in Chicago?
I mean, yeah, I think so. Also, too,
he's not introducing her on Thursday night.
Yes, also, too, there is, I think, a lot of choreography that's gone into the way the convention was going to look. And this is a reminder that this is a brand new ticket. It's a brand new day, and it's a brand new opportunity. And if you're Joe Biden, I think next week probably is a really hard week for him. But then I think he takes a gigantic deep breath, and we hear a lot more of this lighter, airier guy in the future.
All right, Lisa Camusa-Miller and Kristen Hahn, our political panel this evening. Thank you so much for joining us to cover the Democratic ticket and the Republican one as well. Donald Trump still going in Bedminster, New Jersey after more than an hour. Joe.
This is the way we do it around here. We'll keep tabs on it for you and meet you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and Radio.